Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to span the range of the first 11 verses of the fourth chapter in Peter's first epistle. And the theme, which can generally summarize what we're reading, is the principles and what one does while living for God, which we are called to do. And what comes after it in the range we won't be covering in this lesson is a suffering for being a Christian, and this was a fact of life with which they had to deal with. The immediate audience, first century Christian, was not easy. It was literally a life or death decision for a lot of people. And but this, to tie it into the third chapter, of which we've already done in two segments, either in the first of which the range begins. The first 12 verses, we learn of principles of living together, which are more connected thematically to the principles of living for God, whereas the suffering for God, that is what we read of from verses 13 through 22, connect more fully with the suffering for being a Christian. The suffering for God is what gives it meaning and value. So we're going to save our commentary on that for the lesson we save. We were just going to our prelude review of what we already covered. So in the principles of living together, the first group of demographic Peter addresses are the wives, and how he advises them to not only survive but flourish in a relationship with a husband. Your world should not be outward, arranging hair, wearing gold, or putting on dresses, but the hidden man of the heart, with the incorruptible ornament of a meek and peaceable spirit, which is of great value before Elohim. Besides being very useful to a husband, these virtues and these traits and these characteristics also are of value and esteem of Elohim, because they are what makes a marriage work on a woman's end when she's not so concerned with her outward appearance. There's nothing sinful about wanting to look your best but it's the priority that some people are attached to. So fashion can become a form of idolatry for a lot of people, but focus not on without but within. That's what counts in a marriage and in a life. And the husbands are not let off the leash. Peter has only a single verse devoted to them, but what he has to say to them is equally important. In the same way, husbands, live understandably together, giving respect to the wife as to the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life, so that your prayers are not hindered. So what applies to the wives applies to the husbands, the same principles of cohabitation in the same way. That sums up much of what we read earlier. And to live understandably. Now, women are difficult to understand for men, and vice versa, but perhaps more so, at least from my personal experiential vantage point. You can spend a lifetime with one and still not figure out everything there is to understand about her. Women are mysterious creatures by nature and design, but you can still live with understanding when you get to know her and have some empathy for her, and this makes it all possible. And to respect them as the weaker vessel, that just means not to abuse them or physically or verbally or in any way demean them or take advantage of the fact that we are stronger physically and more aggressive creatures to dominate them in any. So that's not really masculine behavior. And I think one of the tragedies of contemporary modernism is this entire notion of toxic masculinity, which caricatures men of creatures of violent and abusive natures, when that is not at all. That the fact that these feminazis would tie that into masculinity is a fatal understanding of what it means to be masculine. And the goal and objective of this all is so that their prayers may not be hindered. If you're beating your wife, your prayers are not going to be answered. because what does it say in the 12th and closing chapter of the prelude we'll be commenting on? Because the eyes of Yahweh are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayers, but the face of Yahweh is against those who do evil. So if you're abusing your wife or exposing her to evil or inducing her to evil or inflicting evil on her in any way, that means your access point to an affirmative response to any of your prayers are greatly diminished, because the eyes of Yahweh are on the righteous and you are not living righteously. Therefore, you are not worthy of the same audience that a righteous person would be when you pray to him. So the ingredients in how we treat our wives are effective in our prayer lives, coming in meaning. And we're just going to read the 18th verse of the third chapter, because verses 19 through 22 are arranged parenthetically. So the therefore of the first word we read of in the first verse of the first chapter of the chapter we'll be covering today is connected to this. Because even Messiah once suffered for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to Elohim, having been put to death, indeed in flesh, but made alive in the spirit. Then there's this whole extrapolation and stuff. But therefore, since Messiah suffered for you in the flesh, arm yourself also with the same mind, because he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. So this is a matter of faith, where we accept by faith the literality of the incarnation. We accept that God became flesh. He bore our frame, our infirmities, our ails, and bore our sin penalty on the cross, the supreme act of love and self-sacrifice. And we should have the similar mind of being self-sacrificial in our love towards others, because he is our example. His suffering teaches us so much, and who has suffered can relate to. Now, what's interesting here is suffering from the flesh has ceased from sin. In the Old Testament, archaic, antiquated theology, sin was always connected with suffering, but by the New Testament, the order appears to be reversed. The prosperous are the ones who are cursing and not blessing, and the ones they are cursing are the ones who are suffering for the name and sake of the Messiah, so that he no longer lives the rest of his time in the flesh for the lust of men, but according to the will of Elohim. So he who bore our flesh and provided our triumph and our example over how to overcome the temptations of the flesh in the desert after a 40-day fast, Matthew 4, Luke 4, more on that, is to not be governed by our flesh, but to be guided and motivated, and to have as our compass the will of Elohim, and not the lust and longing and desires and appetites and peccadillos of our flesh, which lead us nowhere constructive and nowhere positive, but the will of Elohim. We may not like it at the moment, it may entail suffering, but we know that it is a way to a destination which really, really matters, and we're going to be blessed to be guided there. For enough of our past lifetime we have done the desire of the Gentiles, having walked in indecencies, lust, drunkenness, orgies, wild parties, and abominable idolatries. So Peter is addressing this is not something he was personally guilty of. He was never a Gentile, he was a Jew by birth, but these people came from backgrounds and cultures where public indecency was not taboo in some of them. Lust was advertising, drunkenness and orgies, wild parties, etc. Abominable idolatries were not only practiced but accepted and enjoyed. So the way of the Gentiles, now they are Gentiles by backgrounds, but once they become Christians, they lose they cease being Gentiles in the sense that they are outside of the covenantal relationship with God, in which they are surprised that you do not run with them in the same flood of loose behavior, blaspheming. So it actually surprises them. They don't get or understand why we are not following them in the pursuit of their immediate gratification and their perverted lust and peccadillos and just these places and things and activities that lead nowhere. There's darkness where these people are, and they are blinded to the light. So of course they're going to question why we are not moving in the direction of darkness while they are. So their worldview will make sense to them, so much so that they will consider us abnormal for not being governed and walking according to the motivation of our own personal lusts. Who shall give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead? So blaspheming, the final word of the previous verse, it doesn't have to be a literal disrespect of the sacred name. It can do anything that brings dishonor or disrepute, not only on the name, but the one to whom the name it is connected to. And he's the one we have to answer to for this life we have lived at the day of judgment. He is ready, prepared, able, and destined and determined to one day judge the living and the dead. So his jurisdiction over the living and the dead is at the same. And on the day of the judgment, there's going to be those who are living will be called up to judgment, and those who are dead will be raised from the grave to receive the verdict of their eternal destination. For this reason, the good news was also brought to those who are dead, so that whereas they are judged according to men in flesh, they might live according to Elohim in the Spirit. Now this verse is also connected to the first verse of the parenthetical, which writes, in which he also went and proclaimed unto the spirits in prison. He is reference to the Messiah, who is the one referenced in the verse which actually connects to the verse 18 and 19. So we learn that he went to preach to spirits in prisons. So prisons are places, now it's not literal prisons, although the liberation of prisoners is part of the good news message. That's not quite what it is in mind. This prison has spiritual connotations. And so we learn more of it in this, why they was preached to those who were dead, those who had been judged according to men in the flesh. Now he who lives for the flesh dies in the sins of the flesh and is judged accordingly, and they are not living in the will of Elohim, we are called to in the second verse, in the Spirit. But so I think this is speculative, this is personal, this is nothing official, this is my own personal theory. I believe that there is the possibility of being disemboweled, but there is an afterlife, a stage in between eternity and life as we know it on earth, during which one time those who will be internally disembodied in consequence of their failure to pursue or navigate or figure out the plan or path to salvation will still have the chance to have their eternal immortal souls dwelling in the presence of Elohim without the blessing in addition of the resurrected body. This is the ultimate blessings of those who pass the test in life. Afterwards, I do believe there may be an intermediary period where the wicked will be given a chance to respond and repent and thus be spared of death, which is where one's immortal soul dwells in eternal solitude. So how much better is it to dwell in the sacred presence of Him without a body than to be disembodied in a soul lingering in the space of the vastness of infinity and all the darkness alone for all eternity. Eternity is a long time, so there is a second chance after this life. That's just my personal interpretation, for what it's worth. Take it or leave it, or let it influence your own in whatever way, shape, or form it does. But the end of all has drawn near. Therefore be sober-minded and be attentive in the prayers. So the imminence of the hour, he is writing to an audience that is living in expectation of the return of the Master in their lifetime. And so there's always this word of caution and this sense of urgency. Now he admonishes them to be sober-minded, something he also admonishes them to do in their spiritual warfare with Satan, who he likens to a roaring lion seeking some due to his hour. First thing he says is be sober, watch. So these are things we are to do, be sober-minded in approach to the end times and the judgment to come, in just the hour of our doom and destiny potentially, and to be always have that mindfulness reflected in the practice of persistent prayer. Prayer is not a daily thing, it is an all-day thing. To pray night and day is not to pray twice in the day, once in the morning and once at night. It means to pray throughout the day. And above all, have fervent love for one another, because love covers a great number of sins. So this is a citation. The final love covers a great number of sins is a citation of Proverbs 10:12, which we also read of in James 5:20. But the principle communicated there is love covers. So forgiveness and sin and wounds require covering, which forgiveness can do to injuries and offenses we've inflicted onto others and have been inflicted onto us. To give and receive forgiveness covers a great number of sins, because how many sins do we have to forgive? We literally lose track in our moral inventory if we are conducting ourselves honestly. I could not tell you how many times I have sinned in the last day, week, month, and even since I became a Christian, I still sin. The difference is that I'm aware of it, and it's not my settled habit. I lapse and fall because I'm still human, and my flesh is still unredeemed, and Satan uses that to... even though my heart's redeemed and my mind's been redeemed and refreshed, I still live in unredeemed flesh, which is the planting of the beachhead of Satan's strategy. We actually read a lot more of the essential thing in the 5th chapter in reference to Satan as the center of our spiritual warfare. But the first thing he says, even before he quotes the passage which originates in Proverbs, is to above all have fervent love. So above everything else, above all the rest, top priority, number one concern is to have fervent love, and that is love of a degree and dimension which is above and beyond the ordinary amount for one another, and this will eliminate the effects that were caused by sin, which require and necessitate forgiveness. But if we are loving fervently, we will be willfully and instinctively inclined to forgive any and all who offend us in our path, with whom we are living with and walking with and related to. Welcome to one another without grumbling. So that's what we're to do and how we're to do it. It's not enough to welcome someone if you do it with an unfriendly spirit or a grumbling and complaint. We must not view people who show up in our lives for ministerial opportunities as blessings, as curses, but as blessings. People are put in our path, that every person we receive is a test, and every spirit we have is a test. So complaining is a sin. It's to be so concentrated on the negative as to lose sight of the blessings. People who complain are focused and fixated and controlled and influenced by negativity and sin. That is sinful to be that negatively minded. So welcome one another without grumbling, and we have the reason. We just told you why. And as each one has received a gift, serve one another as good trustees of the manifold grace of Elohim. So I have a gift, you have a gift. We know that my gift is teaching, but the fact is that each and every one of you has a spiritual gift out there. It could be preaching, it could be teaching, it could be helps, it could be works, it could be friendliness, it could be any number one of things that you can be. We do not want to limit our definitions or conceptions in the ways in which we can be a witness in the world. And we all have a gift which will enable us to witness in the world, which by serving one another, and it's all made through the power of the grace of Elohim manifolding in our life. So that means it's manifesting and unfolding and working on our behalves, and all grace originates and springs and emanates from Elohim. He is the source of all grace and all power and everything else. If anyone speaks as the words of Yahweh, if anyone serves with the strength which Elohim provides, so that Yahweh might be praised in it all through Yahshua Messiah, to whom belong the esteem and the rule forever and ever. Amen. So everything it's not about, nothing is all about us. It is all about Him. It is His word, the words of Yahweh. If everyone speaks, let His word be judged and measured and assessed according to the standard of the word of Yahweh. If anyone serves, let him not do it apart from the strength which one who is submitted to Elohim will receive. If a man attempts to do it on his own natural strength, he's going to give up before the race is even started, if not over, without that which Elohim provides. And we exist to praise Elohim through Yahshua Messiah, and to both of these people he establishes a divine equality between the Father and the Son. Belong the esteem and the rule forever and ever. So they are eternal creatures. Their equal superiority, their superiority and equality in jurisdiction and sovereignty and all the rest are as old as eternity itself, because they are eternal creatures. So that's one of the messages I cannot communicate enough, is to always focus on the eternal while you are living in the moment, to have thoughts of eternity fill your head. That's one of the most special items of equipment from Paul's list of spiritual warfare in Ephesians 6 is the helmet of salvation. So to fill your heads with thoughts of salvation will expel and eliminate any counterproductive thought which will distract you from being a witness and an evangelist and spreading the faith. And I hope that's the reason you're here. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.